So brilliant, thank you so much. For those of you who don't know very much about the Young Liberals, we represent not only the under 30s in the party, but also students and apprentices, people who are both full-time and part-time. And we do a whole bunch of things. We do our own conferences to help people learn how to debate and write policy. We run campaigns. We have a lot of work to get young people elected in the party. And yeah, we're just the voice for young people in the party, and we do an awful lot. But yes, cracking on. Thank you so much to Mark and Wendy for being here with us today. I know you'll both have super interesting perspectives to bring to this debate. So firstly, handing over to Wendy Chamberlain MP, powerhouse and Chief Whip. Go for it.
Powerhouse. I was joking today. It may have missed people's attention, but the new SNP Chief Whip, who was only appointed just prior to Christmas when the leadership at Westminster for the SNP changed, resigned today and has been replaced by Brendan O'Hara MP. And somebody pointed out to me that I'm a pillar of stability from a Chief Whip perspective, given that I am now the longest serving Chief Whip by quite some distance. I mean, Alan Campbell from Labour isn't far behind me, but there's absolutely no doubt that some of the turnover we've seen within the SNP and the Conservatives of late has been quite something. And I certainly don't feel, having been elected in 2019, that I'm any kind of parliamentary process expert, but I'm learning all the time. And I've been asked to, and it's fantastic to be here, and thank you to both LDR and Young Liberals for hosting tonight's event. And I know that this is a topic that Liberal Democrats we care about. It's probably one of the things we might argue about the voting system that we might like to see from a PR perspective. But given that almost Liberal Democrats, are you even a Liberal Democrat if you agree with every party policy? Sometimes it feels that there must be something you disagree with to truly be a Liberal Democrat. I do think this is an area of policy where we are across the party membership very much aligned. And the first thing I've been asked in terms of comments to make is why achieving PER matters to the Lib Dems as a priority and why it matters. And I think you only have to look at what we have seen today to see that. So for those of you who've not been following the news today, my day was supposed to involve a nice lunch with somebody from the New Statesman, but that's not how it worked out because of what's taking place in Parliament today, which is, you may be aware that before Christmas, the Scottish Parliament passed legislation in relation to reform of the gender recognition reforms, and I know that there are different views within the party on that, but that was passed within the competence of the Scottish Parliament, and the UK government have decided to table for the first time since devolution in 1999 to table what's called a Section 35, which basically means that the UK government will not give royal assent to the Scottish Government bill, despite the fact that it does refer to devolved matter. The reason they're doing that is they say that it impacts on reserved issues. And the reality is that Section 35 will be tabled and will happen because the UK government have an 80-seat majority in Parliament, despite the fact that in the Scottish Parliament, MSPs from all parties, including the Conservatives, voted by 2/3 of them indeed voted to support this legislation. And I think that demonstrates to you that there is a democratic deficit in the UK. And as somebody who is a Scottish MP for a UK party, it does feel sometimes like the Conservatives are sleeper agents for the Scottish National Party, and it's very, very frustrating. So that is one of the reasons why it matters, because what we see from first past the post is a disproportionate number of seats in relation to the votes cast for a party. And it's always been something that's mattered to us. And we have seen that these more PR processes or voting systems do work. We see it in Scotland, we see it in Wales, indeed we see it in Northern Ireland as well in terms of the Assembly elections. They produce parliaments that are more representative of the votes that have been cast for each party. And given where we are in relation to Brexit, as well as the future of the UK, a number of those big issues and topics, as well as how we deal with issues that are just, so huge, such as climate crisis, that for me demonstrates why it is a priority. The second thought I had in relation to this was what you may have also seen in the news last week, which was the Sky News database in relation to MPs' declarations. And, you know, for me, if we want to get big money out of politics, changing the voting system would be one of the ways that we would achieve that, because what we see is, and it does tend to be Conservatives sitting in incredibly safe seats, either earning lots of money or receiving lots of money in donations. So, you know, for that transparency, trust, yeah, I'm conscious that my job doesn't mean that I'm very well thought of by the general population, and I'd love to be in a position to change that. In terms of the current state of play and the external landscape in relation to Labour, yes, as Keith has pointed out, Labour have passed a policy that says that they are supportive of proportional representation, but we are not seeing a real appetite for that from the Labour leadership. And there's a variety of reasons for that. I think part of it is just generally that Labour are starting to think and have an expectation that they will be forming the next government, and potentially as a result, therefore, they need to be making, or feel that they need to be making, some other decisions on that basis. But I'm sure you'll all be aware of the report that Gordon Brown did and the recommendations around Lord's Reform, and indeed I think there's been a recognition from Gordon and others that PR is part of that. So you know, you can change the House of Lords, but if you don't change the voting system, we're actually not going to unpick a number of the things that we see. And then you'll also be aware of the changes, the retrograde changes to the voting processes in England. That's both in terms of voter ID, which will come in at the local elections in England in May, and you know, I would love to see that the government, even though I might fundamentally disagree with what they're doing, are implementing this voter ID process in a transparent, inclusive, communicative way. But it will not surprise you to hear that none of those things are happening. And there is absolutely no doubt that there will be voters that are disenfranchised in England come May as a result of that. And as well as that, it's the changes to some of the voting processes around police and crime commissioners and mayoral elections that are also retrograde steps. So I think people, you know, the Conservatives should be careful what they wish for. When they've presented better voting options to people in the past, they're going to be dealing with the consequences of going back on those bits. And the last point I was asked to talk about was how PR might be achieved. And there's absolutely no doubt that the next election is part of that. And the Liberal Democrats are very much part of ensuring that the Conservatives are not forming the next government, and they need to. And I just wanted to conclude, and because I'm sure as part of the Q&A we'll be talking more about how that PR might be achieved, and indeed I've spoken with LDR colleagues before. Nothing is guaranteed in this, but I do agree with Keith that this does feel like one of the best opportunities that we potentially have coming for a long time. But just to conclude, I just picked up a tweet just literally before I came on the call, having ventured onto Twitter for the first time since putting something in relation to gender reform on Twitter last night. But Ben Walker, who some of you will be aware, you know, does some of the data for the New Statesman, etc., said, "Only just hit me how obscene the government abolishing the supplementary vote system for mayoral elections is." But then underneath he said, "This is true. The only good thing about this is it establishes a precedent for arbitrarily changing electoral systems without faffing about with referendums." So potentially the government might have just given us a backdoor to avoiding what we saw in 2012. That if we look at a more collaborative approach, a citizens' assembly, those kind of things, potentially we get to a position where we can make changes to PR via manifestos, etc., without going to referendum. And again, as a Scottish MP, I'd be delighted to have no more referendums in the foreseeable future. Thanks, Janie. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Wendy. That was fascinating, and it's great to hear some optimism about, you know, us really having a potential in the near future, hopefully, to make some real movements on this issue. So before I hand over to Mark, we will be going to a Q&A after Mark's spoken. If you have any questions, please do send me a direct message in the chat, and I will take a note of them and then ask them after Mark spoke. But for the time being, passing on to Mark Pack, President of the Lib Dems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janie. It's lovely to join you all. And Wendy, it feels like you have been around much longer than you actually technically have if one checks the calendar and the diary, but that is genuinely, I think, a real
I'm sure
tribute.
you mean that kindly.
Absolutely, it's genuinely meant as a tribute to the way you have so quickly become such an essential part of the party's sort of parliamentary and overall presence. And yes, I wish you good luck with your Twitter notifications. I can imagine it is not a fun time to be tweeting about our support for the gender recognition reform in Scotland, but hugely important that we are publicly supporting that measure. So thank you for that. And I think electoral reform and introducing fair votes for the House of Commons in Westminster, and I always try to remember that extra bit about say this is about Westminster, because of course electoral reform in different ways is now very well established in many bits of the UK, not only in Northern Ireland but in Wales and Scotland, and indeed in a somewhat I think from a Lib Dem perspective, unsatisfactory but important way in local government, in terms of the London Assembly and the London Mayor, and for the moment at least until it's abolished, the supplementary vote system for mayors around England as well. But there is a real importance about getting electoral reform for the House of Commons. And I think it's a twofold one from a Lib Dem perspective. One is the importance, because we know how important it is for the country, that changing the way Parliament works in Westminster is so important to improving so many other issues about how our country is run and how our public services perform and the sort of society that we have. But there's also a slightly more insular importance of electoral reform, which is that as a party of the size that we currently are in Westminster, the opportunity to really influence what happens through perhaps, for example, a hung parliament is an opportunity that doesn't come around that often. And when it does come around, it is therefore so important that we use that opportunity to make changes and to get policies through that are really long lasting in their impact. Because it can be lovely during a parliament where we have some influence to make some improvements to the day-to-day way in which parliament and government is run, but there's then such a big risk that they simply get undone and swept aside if we don't have then such a good election result at some future date. So electoral reform for Westminster, I think, is absolutely central to our opportunities to make use of any future parliamentary power in Westminster to make a long-lasting change that long outlasts those MPs and that parliamentary dynamic that we have, in the way that, for example, in Featherstone's success in getting same-sex marriage legalised is a reform that has long outlasted our subsequent electoral travails, and that is a really important lesson for us there. I think also electoral reform is really important to us in a sort of a slightly frustrating way, because to achieve electoral reform for the House of Commons will almost certainly require the MPs of another party, most likely the Labour Party, to fully support it. It's really hard to see a route to electoral reform that doesn't involve lots of MPs from either Labour or the Tories, more likely Labour in current circumstances, supporting electoral reform. And that means there's a slightly different tone necessarily, I think, to our approach to campaigning on this issue. Because while it is very tempting to, stick the boot into Labour on all sorts of issues, and actually getting Labour MPs to vote for electoral reform is probably not best achieved by the Lib Dems consistently criticising them over their historic record of rather lukewarm support for electoral reform, being in favour of it right up until the chance where they got to introduce it, and then suddenly discovering reasons to no longer be in favour of it. And I think that's why the cross-party work that I know Lib Dems for electoral reform have been particularly important to, and huge thanks to Keith and Sarah and others on the call for your role in that, is actually really important on an issue like this. We do need a more collaborative, a more cross-party approach, and to sometimes bite our lips perhaps a little bit at our frustrations over Labour's somewhat lukewarm record on this issue, because in the end, the way we're going to get a better electoral system that serves everyone in the country better is going to require a degree of cross-party cooperation. But it also requires us as a party to treat the issue really seriously and to make it a priority. And I hope that those of you, for example, who heard Ed Davies' replacement conference speech a little while ago, where he gave a sort of keynote speech to replace the one he would have given at our autumn conference that sadly had to be cancelled, electoral reform had a really important part in that speech. And whilst it's obviously only very rarely going to be the sort of issue that we might put on the front page of a leaflet, because we know that for voters, they're really concerned about what happens if they have to ring 999. How long is it going to take if an ambulance is needed this evening? They're really worried about how are they going to afford their next grocery shop? How are they going to afford the next set of fuel bills that they receive? So we know that electoral reform is really important to cracking those issues in the long term. But of course, the public expect to hear us talking most about those issues that are most immediately of importance to them. But it absolutely needs to continue to be part of the package of policies that we talk about. And I think it was really heartening how much that Ed therefore did talk about electoral reform in that replacement speech. And I think hopefully gives all of you confidence as well that what you have heard and will hear from Wendy and I this evening is properly reflected also in what our priorities are over the next few years. So I just really wanted to sort of end with saying one other thing, which is about the importance of Lib Dems for electoral reform, because as I mentioned, the importance of that cross-party working, that importance of continuing to talk about and working on electoral reform, even if it isn't necessarily always the front page story on a focus leaflet. Lib Dems for electoral reform have a really important part to play in that. So huge thanks to Keith and Sarah and others on the call for all the work that you've done for that. And if any of you are not yet members of Lib Dems for electoral reform, I hope you will be by the time the call is over.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, thank you so much, Wendy and Mark. That was brilliant, and very happy to see lots of questions in already. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, please do send me a direct message. If you would like to ask them verbally, you're more than welcome to as well, but just drop me a message so I know to call on you. So straight in then, we've had a question. Would you be prepared to place electoral reform as a requirement to form any coalition with any party in future general elections? Wendy, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah. So I think this is where what we want from a policy perspective and the realpolitik, as it were, comes into potential, not conflict, but we have to think very carefully about how we structure our conversations. So I think what Mark referred to in terms of Ed's speech last year and what would have been his conference speech had it been given in Brighton, God, my brain went blank there for a second, shows the importance that we and he place on electoral reform as a party. And this is the same conversation as we have around progressive alliances, that as soon as you say what your red lines are, there's a potential of kind of being held to ransom by them as well. I think we have to think very carefully about where our targets are in terms of where we hope to grow at the next election. Given that in 90 seats we were second to the Conservatives, and you may have seen a blue door, a blue wall, a blue Boris bubble. We are very focused on taking seats from the Conservatives, and to win those seats, we need to not just squeeze the Labour vote that exists in those seats, or indeed eat our greens. We need to convince soft Conservative voters to support us. And so what I'm saying to you is we are very supportive of electoral reform, but we will not be giving out red lines in advance of any election. And what I would say is, trust me, as a politician of infinite experience, as Mark mentioned, that there are very good reasons for doing so. I would like to think that one of the things that I have done over my 3 years in my engagement with LDER is make LDR feel closer to the parliamentary party and the decision-making processes. And I hope very much that that has demonstrated to everybody who's passionate about electoral reform how important and seriously our MPs take it.
Thank you so much. Mark, would you like to add anything on that?
Yeah, I'd just add one thing, because I know, it's reasonable, particularly to say for those of you on the call who had the experience of the 2010 to 15 coalition, and where the most we were able to get, or the most our negotiating team were able to get at the time, was a referendum on AV, which certainly in hindsight feels like it was not the best of outcomes of that. It's very understandable to be sort of nervous or concerned about what might happen in the future. So I hope it gives reassurance that if you look at that speech of Ed's, basically the only policy area that he talked about in that speech in any detail, which isn't at the top of the list of voters' priorities, is electoral reform. That was the one exception, as it were, to his really hard-nosed focus on, let's focus as much of our public attention as we can possibly get on the things that voters most immediately see on the doorsteps matter to them most. Electoral reform was given a very special and privileged position in that sense in Ed's speech. So I hope that helps give everyone confidence that the sorts of things that, you know, Wendy and I have said are absolutely backed up by what, you know, you can expect of the party in the coming years.
Thank you so much. Lots and lots of questions coming in, which is brilliant. Brendan has asked to ask a question verbally. Brendan, if you'd like to pop in.
Hi, yes, thank you, Janie. Hi, Mark. Hi, Wendy. I wanted to basically ask about how, if we were to have any cross-party talks, how we would actually basically all be kept in the loop, because as I've seen here in Wales, we were having cross-party talks between Labour, Plaid, the Lib Dems, including at one point the Conservatives until they dropped out. But then Labour and Plaid went ahead. They've decided that they want to introduce sort of a less proportional closed party list voting system. They also want a zip voting where you go by gender, so male, female, back to male. It's not, let's say, preferred by us, I guess. And I even asked Jane Dodds about how this would affect us when it comes to choosing transgender candidates or non-binary candidates. You know, what would it mean for them by using such a system here in Wales? So how can we make sure that we're kept in the loop in such cross-party talks?
And Mark, I'll take this one first as well, if I may, just simply because before Christmas, I chaired an APPG for Electoral Reform meeting, which was specifically looking at Wales and the proposals. And in fact, Jane was part of that. And what's quite interesting for me is actually, I would say that I was pretty confident on the basis of that session that, and it might be recorded and be somewhere, I can see if I can try and find it, but that Labour, you know, within Labour, there was not general agreement for what Labour were doing, that potentially, you know, there was that bit where it could be seen as a stitch up. I suppose where we have the advantage from a Westminster perspective, and this is me talking post-election, is that, you know, what we were looking at in terms of parties will be, you know, we will have a significant role to play, because there's absolutely no doubt that the constitutional implications of working with the SNP will, you know, if Labour are the biggest party but not in a majority, is quite difficult. So I think, again, the real politics will come into play where that gives us some useful leverage. I suppose the situation that we will want to be wary of is where we ended up in 97, where there was good conversations in relation to this. It looked like that was the direction of travel. I'm thinking I'm talking to young Liberals about 1997 here. Anyway, but I wasn't a Lib Dem either. But the challenge here is that you know, the size of the Labour majority meant that they were able to discard us. I simply don't think we'll be in the same position again. And the reason I think that is simply because, you know, even if Labour make inroads in Scotland, they're not going to be looking at the numbers that they had back in 97. And as a result, Labour may be the largest party, but, you know, despite what the polls are saying, the actual swing that Labour needs to win a majority is pretty significant, and there's absolutely no doubt that, and this is indeed what the government are hoping, you know, that the polls will eventually narrow. So Brendan, I think what I would say is we are absolutely alive to that, and we'll be doing all we can. And I would like to think that we will have, you know, it's, did I say it's more difficult to overlook us here in Westminster as opposed to what sadly is our only MS in Wales. But yeah, it's a risk. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you so much. I was born in 2003 for context.
Yes.
Mark, would you like to hop in?
Yeah, it makes me feel very old making references to what worked in the 1990s. But I think maybe just to add to what Wendy said on your question, Brendan, is I think you know, it's really important that if we are in that sort of situation where we do have additional sort of political leverage in Westminster, that the viewpoint of party members is reflected in how that is used, because we are a democratic party and it's one of our huge strengths. It is also, frankly, pragmatically, a strength in, you know, any negotiations that, you know, might happen at any point. if the people carrying out those negotiations can absolutely genuinely use the lever of, well, also, in the end, we're going to have to get our party members to agree with this. That can actually be quite helpful. And I think it's really useful in that sense that part of our party rule book is that if there were to be, and there's a whole set of ifs in this, but if there were to be a hung parliament and if there were to be some sort of negotiated agreement with one or more other parties, then there would need to be a special conference to either endorse or to reject that approach. So there is an important democratic safeguard there. It is also, I suspect, if we do have that sort of situation, it will be the toughest and hardest working bit of my tenure in office as your federal party president, because in a way, part of the reason for having somebody who's elected by all party members to the role that I hold is absolutely to be your voice in those situations. So I would expect a very busy inbox and notifications tab in that period, and absolutely would be very keen to make sure that the voice of members is properly heard and reflected.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So next question, and this is a slightly longer one. One thing we have really seen over the last few decades from the different parties of the lack of a clear narrative as to what they ultimately want for the country. Would it not be in ours and the public's interest to make PR/electoral reform our top priority going into the next general election, especially in the midst of current government's consistent attacks on British democracy? Mark, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, I think, in a democracy, voters get to choose what is most important when they decide who to vote for. And we might want to persuade them. We might sometimes think they make their choice wrongly. But fundamentally, voters get to choose. And the risk is, if we talk about something that voters feel is not the most relevant, most important thing to them, they end up deciding on the basis of something else. And, in a way, we saw this in 2019, even in 2019, with all of the circumstances of that election, where we tried to make the election about Brexit. Lots of voters said, actually, you know what? The choice isn't about Brexit, the choice is about Corbyn or Johnson. And they chose their votes on a different basis. So my fear with that sort of approach that the person asking the question suggested is lots of voters would turn around and say, actually, you know what? The most important thing is the state of the NHS. The most important thing is the cost of living crisis. Maybe the most important thing is the existential threat of climate change. And whilst absolutely we know that electoral reform is important to fixing all of those issues, and we know that it's part of the solution, if we say that's the most important thing, and other parties say the most important thing is the NHS, the voters would in the end pick one of the parties that's talking about the NHS.
Thank you very much. Wendy, over to you.
Yeah, I don't think I have much to add beyond Mark. Indeed, the argument that Mark is making is exactly the argument that we are making in Scotland in relation to the SNP calls to make the next general election a de facto referendum. Because the reality is voters, a general election campaign is never what you think a general election campaign is going to be about in terms of the issues. And so I think that is the issue for us. I don't know if any of you have seen the video of Suella Braverman responding to the Holocaust survivor over the last couple of days, where the Holocaust survivor talks about some of the language that Suella Braverman uses, talking about migrants and those coming in small boats. And the most depressing aspect of that for me was not what Suella Braverman said, but the big round of applause that she got after she said it. So we live in a democracy. Sometimes voters, we don't agree with what they vote for and what they say, but we need to have a degree of where we respect that. And I think where we do well is where we engage at a local level and we find out from our constituents the issues that they care about, and that at a local level we actually deliver that change. But other than that, I wouldn't have more to add.
Thank you so much. So next question. In order to appeal to as much of the electorate as possible, should we endorse none of the above voting? And for those of you who don't know what none of the above voting is, I believe this just refers to having an option on the ballot paper, which is none of the above. So you can express.
Ron. We're bringing Ron into parliamentary elections.
Well, yeah. Would you like to go first, Wendy?
I think it's an interesting concept, but I suppose we have to consider the consequence of that. None of the above. What is the outcome for that. And I'm coming to this completely cold. I've not heard about this before. This is maybe a bit where maybe I'm demonstrating my age again here, but I'm not aware of it. So I suppose the consequence for me is if none of the above win, does that leave those constituents unrepresented? Because I think that if you follow it through to its logical conclusion is the consequence. And it sounds like I need to take up Lucy's reading list offer there. So I suppose that is the consequence. And I suppose what it tells me is this is where we are in terms of trust in our politicians. One of the things I've become known for in the last 3 years is my kind of standards stuff and the work that I've done there. And one of the things I find quite depressing about that is, you know, I just believe that I'm being pretty common sense sensible and have, you know, a degree of expectation about how my MP colleagues should behave, and for that to be seen as extraordinary and me as some kind of sleazebuster champion is quite something. So yeah, I'd like to learn more about the concept, but I think what we need to ensure is that people always have representation.
Absolutely. Mark, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I think certainly in things like internal party elections and arrangements, quite often I've, you know, over the last few years been arguing in favour of us having, say, a reopened nominations or none of the above type option. And I think a good example of when that can work well, in fact, we will have coming up at Spring Conference, because the Federal Board will hopefully, if we get the right applicants in, be putting some names to conference to approve to be members of our Federal Appeals Panel. And that will in effect be, you know, a conference voting to put them in that post or not. And conference will have the choice to say no to a name, and it could say no to all of the names. So there will be in that sense, none of the above option. And I think that will work, because if the board, you know, if we get it wrong and if we put a really bad set of names to the party or conference and you vote none of the above, that tells the board to go away, do a better job, get a better set of names together. And we have an existing appeals panel that will still be in place, that will still be able to do things like rule on appeals in between time. So it's not like the appeals panel's work would come to a sort of catastrophic halt, and absolutely you'd know who to blame and who to hold to account to make sure you come up with a better set of names next time around. So that process, I think, absolutely is really valuable, although obviously I hope when it comes to conference, none of you will feel a need to use that process this time around. Where I'm unsure, and I guess remain to be convinced on, is that sort of process could work, say, at a general election, because if you have no one elected as an MP, does the previous MP continue in post, which feels like that could come with all sorts of problems. But if the MP doesn't continue in post and therefore somewhere doesn't have an MP, that area is therefore in effect unrepresented. And there are definitely downsides that come with that as well. So I guess I would be open to persuasion, but nervous about how well it would work for a public election, such as for a parliament or for a council.
Yeah. I just saw the comment there about spoiled ballots. I mean, I love the people that come and spoil their ballots. I mean, one, they give me a laugh because sometimes some of the language and pictures might be quite footy on them, but there is something, I don't know, maybe it is the liberal in me that feels like that people have chosen to exercise their democratic right to vote by drawing a male anatomy on their ballot paper, as in they have taken the time to do that, to register their dissent, and you know, that is a good thing, because they could just, you know, much better that than voter apathy.
It is possible to draw other items on ballot papers once
yes.
to express dissent.
Brilliant. Right, so I've had a couple of questions come through on Compass and their Winners Won campaign, and they're sort of encouraging tactical voting in order to help get the Tories out. So yeah, we'd love to know your thoughts on Compass's work encouraging tactical voting, but also whether or not it's a good idea to stand back in some constituencies from our perspective. Mark, would you like to go first?
I mean, tactical voting is the important part very often of when we win under first past the post. So clearly, you know, it has its advantages, and it would be churlish to think that, you know, only tactical voting, where it's tactical voting for the Lib Dems, is the only sort of tactical voting that should ever happen. You know, one has to recognise that if one's in a world in which we have an electoral system that incentivises people to vote tactically, you know, we will do our best, you know, to get benefit from it when we can, but recognise that sometimes others will benefit from it. I think the thing that is tricky about the party sort of openly embracing, say, tactical voting that involves voting for other parties or doing things like not standing candidates is that, for example, the next general election is very likely, may not be, but very likely to be on the same day as council elections. And even if it's not on the same day as council elections, then there will be council elections, and indeed elections to things like the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Senedd, probably not that long after the next Westminster general election. And if you encourage people to vote for another party or don't stand in a seat in one election, it doesn't just have an impact on that election, it has a longer term impact on our credibility and our ability to win elections in those areas. And I think, for example, you know, if you look at the areas where we have had sort of sustained long-term success, almost always that involves building up to sort of fully contesting a large number of, you know, council seats and ending up, you know, fighting seriously nearly all, if not all, the council seats in that area. And one of the reasons that often then goes with being successful, say, at Westminster or Scottish Parliament or other election levels, is there's a degree of credibility that comes with that in terms of people regularly seeing the Lib Dems on the ballot paper, regularly hearing from the Lib Dems locally and so on. So I think there is some real long-term damage that can be done if the public see us opting out of standing in elections. But definitely there is real value in being sensible and strategic about where we put our effort in. And, you know, we see this year in, year out in local elections. There are lots of people like myself, in fact, you know, I stood as a candidate in a ward last May. I didn't do any canvassing in my ward. I didn't put out any leaflets in my ward, but I did do canvassing in April and May in other target wards. And that was, you know, absolutely the best way, I think, of squaring the circle between needing to build the long-term credibility of the party and also campaigning in a way that is sensible and effective under first past the post.
Thank you so much. Wendy?
Yeah, again, I probably don't have much to add, but now I'll say something. I suppose when I think back to the 2019 election, you know, why did the Conservatives come away with an 80-seat majority beyond the voting system? They came away with that because the Reform Party or the Brexit Party or whatever they were called at that time stood down. You know, there is absolutely no doubt that we would be looking at very different, not necessarily any Brexit Party MPs, but we'd be looking at a very different set of results, I think, if the Brexit Party hadn't made that decision. So I suppose what that does is absolutely demonstrate what candidates standing down en masse can do. But the reality is do we want to consider ourselves as a party such as the Reform Party as it is now, or do we want to position ourselves as we have always done, so as a party that is capable and competent in holding power? And I think my second point is just what Mark said, but look at it in relation to our by-elections in terms of we don't necessarily need to stand down as a candidate, but you know, it's important to remember that on the same days the Tiverton and Honiton by-election, there was also the Wakefield by-election. You know, Daisy went because she's great and flew the flag there, even wearing a red suit with our candidate, and we're hugely grateful to him for doing so. But there's absolutely no doubt that our time, energy and resources were put into Tiverton and Honiton, not only in relation to the campaign, but our stonking, albeit cheesy, slightly cringy blue door tactics afterwards. Because, you know, the other important thing is not only did we win that by-election, Labour were expected to win Wakefield, we weren't. We turned over that huge majority. Plus, if you think back, all people remember is, you know, our post-election celebration. So we very much imprinted ourselves and our narrative on people's consciousness too.
Thank you. So I'm probably not going to have time to go through everyone's questions, so apologies if I don't manage to get to yours. Tom Brake has a question that he would like to ask verbally. So Tom, if you'd like to pop in, please go for it.
Great. Thank you very much, Jenny. So my question would be, what more can Liberal Democrat MPs and Liberal Democrat members do to perhaps improve the relationship with Labour MPs and perhaps SNP MPs, so that if after the next general election there is the possibility of PR, that prospect is maximised because there is a strong working relationship between the two. I know that, Wendy, you mentioned APPGs, but I'm wondering if there are any other things that could be done to foster a good working relationship, if only on the subject of PR.
Wendy, if you'd like to go for it.
Yeah. So the APPG for Electoral Reform's an interesting one in that Alex Sobel was the chair, and they agreed. Apparently, the reason it was agreed that he was the chair was to kind of make it, that it was a safe space potentially for Labour MPs. But it doesn't feel like it's been the most proactive of APPGs, and I certainly think we could be exploiting more on that. I think the work that you do on Unlock Democracy and those other groups is very important too in building that degree of consensus. I suppose my reticence from an SNP perspective is just that, the unintended, because the consequences are always intended. But I think their position in relation to PR is pretty solid. I don't see it as something that they would renege on if the opportunity arose to deliver it. But there's absolutely no doubt that that is not their primary purpose for being in this place. I am wondering if the voter ID stuff that comes in May will be the next opportunity to build a degree of consensus, because I think we're all pretty agreed on this call that we've got real concerns about what that might mean. So I think that's maybe our next opportunity. But I'm happy to hear other suggestions, and Tom, it would be good to check in, because I know we haven't spoken for a wee while, particularly with the public order stuff that's just come off the conveyor belt as well.
Thank you. Mark, if you'd like to add anything.
Yeah, I guess the one thing maybe to add to what Wendy said is that, when we campaign locally, there are all sorts of different organisations and pressure groups and institutions that we're used to engaging with. And, it's very normal for Lib Dems campaigning to engage with things like local school governors or the local churches organisation, or visit the local mosque, or engage with the local business forums in different ways. And I think one group or set of organisations that's often missing from that are the local trade union structures. There's often just as many ways to engage with trade unions through local structures as there is through the business community, through local structures. And I think, that would be a good and useful thing to do anyway, but undoubtedly the trade union voice is an important part of the Labour movement. And I think one of the ways we can help build that degree of maybe slightly wary trust, or slightly wary cooperation across party lines on an issue like this, is having that broader engagement on other issues that are of common concern. So I think that's an important part of the overall picture.
Thank you so much. A somewhat related question. What do you both think it will take to bring the Labour leadership on side with PR? Either of you are welcome to start first. Mark, if you want to come back.
I think it's really hard to figure out what Keir Starmer really thinks on electoral reform. And I've listened at some length to interviews, and there was actually a really interesting podcast interview he gave with Matt Ford for the Political Party podcast, where Matt Ford got him to go into this issue in some detail. But I think it's really difficult to figure out what he really thinks. And indeed, it may well be that actually he himself, in the depths of his soul, doesn't really quite know where he would come down until he's put on the spot, potentially at some point in the future. But I think the one thing that we can be pretty clear about is the stronger the Lib Dem voice is, the greater the political power we have, the more likely it is that when push comes to shove, Labour will come down the right side of this issue. Because I think there is, and I think in terms of what I'm about to say, I don't think the Lib Dems will necessarily be that different. So I'm not sort of throwing stones in making this point, but I think there is undoubtedly the case that when push has come to shove in the past, Labour is really tempted to go for the option of sort of hating the Tories, as opposed to the option of looking for cooperation. So, after 97, they went for the sort of the narrow-minded perspective rather than seizing the opportunity to reform the House of Commons. Or if you look in, Ed Miliband's tenure as Labour leader, Labour didn't go for the full-throated support for electoral reform. Labour didn't go for the full-throated support for House of Lords reform. Disliking the Tories just sort of trumped that. So I think, You know, the one bit can be sure about is the stronger the Lib Dem voice is, the more chance there is of being able to push Labour in the right direction. Maybe one should say, in fairness to Labour, in the direction of its better instincts, rather than in terms of its not so good instincts.
The short answer, in agreement with Mark, is how we get Labour moving on electoral reform is having them not to win an overall majority at the next election, because that's where we have the opportunity for leverage. So that's why it's important that, you know, in the target seats we've identified, we make progress, but we also make progress elsewhere as well. I mean, I just feel for Labour that their position, particularly given party policy now, just becomes increasingly untenable to be the only social democratic movement in Europe that doesn't support PR. And I think there is absolutely no doubt that what we're seeing at the polls at the moment is an apathy for the Conservatives as opposed to a full-throated support for Labour. And so I think they are coming to the crunch point where they have to determine whether they are happy to be, they're happy in the UK to be a social democratic movement that gets to be in power every so often for 10 to 12 years, punctuating a continued Conservative, because, you know, like loathe or otherwise the Conservatives, they are the most successful Conservative political party, I think, from a global perspective, let alone a European perspective. And so PR is a very obvious way to arrest that and dare I say it, properly represent the views of the wider UK electorate.
Thank you so much. Right, I'll bring us to our final question and then we will wrap up. What can we as party members and as individuals be doing to further the cause for proportional representation? Wendy, if you want to start on that.
Campaign to get more Liberal Democrats elected. I am very conscious that you know, when we get people involved in the party, it does feel like we sometimes just give them a bundle of leaflets, and I think we all have a responsibility where we're involved and active and engaged in our local parties to find out about the other things that people have skills in policy otherwise and things like that as well. But there's absolutely no doubt that all of us got involved in politics in the first place, or got involved particularly with this party, is because we want this party to do well, and we want this party in a position where it can wield power and make practical differences to people's lives. So, frankly, that's the first thing. The second thing is probably linked to Tom's question, is around having that degree of engagement with those sort of, you know, cross-party organisations and civil society more generally. But you know, I think the two things that I would ask people to take away today is potentially, if you can join the Young Liberals, join the Young Liberals. All of you can join LDER, but yeah, seriously get involved and help get more Liberal Democrats elected.
Absolutely. Now, Mark, would you like to add anything?
Well, hard to add anything to that from Wendy, other than maybe to echo the point that absolutely the number of Lib Dems we get elected at the next general election is a really important factor in increasing the chances of securing electoral reform for Westminster. So remember, every time you see a cheesy photo of a Lib Dem pointing at a pothole, that is part of the road to electoral reform, as well as hopefully the route to literally getting the road repaired. But I'd absolutely echo the point about the importance of both unlocked democracy, sort of outside the party and within the party, Lib Dems for electoral reform and Young Liberals. So there's a good trio of organisations there to join, or if you're maybe too old to be a member of Young Liberals, to financially support at least. So a good trio of organisations there to support, and I'd really encourage everyone to do so.
If I can just make one more point, Janie, for those who don't know, my seat was the most marginal seat in the UK, where we lost by 2 votes to the SNP in 2017. And you know, the next election will be fought on first past the post. There's just no getting away from it. What we don't want to be in is a position where we could have got maybe another 5-6 seats, but we came down to those very narrow margins. So I think it's really important that we don't lose that focus.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Wendy and Mark, for coming. It's been a really interesting evening, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions as well. I think this has been a great conversation. So yes, if you're not a member of the Young Liberals and you're eligible to be, please join. If you're not a member of the Young Liberals nor eligible to be, you can still support us. If you join us as a friend of Young Liberals, you can support us and stay in the loop about the things we're doing. So I'll put a link to that in the chat. Otherwise, I'll hand back over to Keith if you'd like to wrap up.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Janie. And I think I probably qualified to be a friend of the Young Liberals rather than anything else, so I'll follow that up. I just wanted to say just a couple of things about what we're doing. The speaker's been kind enough to say what we're doing cross-party, and in turn, I must acknowledge the bridges and the connections that Unlock Democracy, Tom's here tonight, I can see people from Make Votes Matter, also Compass who've been mentioned, the Electoral Reform Society. As LDER, we work very proactively across with those groups, and that does include engagement with other parties as well, which we think is crucial. But we do work within the party as well. And one of the things we're doing, I was interested in the comment about, where does PR fit into our narrative? And our view is you don't lead with it because it is not the #1 issue on the doorstep, but you don't hide it either. And we're working with ALDC to put some messaging and some content together, which we're going to try and trial it this May and then consolidate it as the year goes on, with a view that it's not going to be if you take your focus leaflet, it's not going to be a headline first page, but it might be a substantial story on page 2 or somewhere. So it's in there in the narrative and part of what we're trying to put across. And so that's what we'll be working on. Otherwise, I think Janie has already thanked Wendy and Mark. LDR would like to thank you as well, and also thank you both for the great support you give to LDER. And could I also, oh yes, Tom has just also put in, try to put the 24th of May down in your diaries, because that's going to be a huge combined effort led by the cross-party groups, Tom's organisation Unlock Democracy, Make Votes Matter, Compass, the Electoral Reform Society, to really bring some mass pressure and lobbying to make sure MPs do understand that it is an issue which is on the public mind. If it's not in their inbox or their mailbag, then they're tempted to think it's not important. Sorry, a slight aside there to give a plug to what Tom was just saying. Otherwise, I would like to thank everyone this evening. Could I particularly thank the Young Liberals, Janie and Katie, who've done so much to make this happen. And I really do hope this is the beginning of an ongoing working relationship between us, because there is so much to do, and it's great to have that exchange and look forward to working with you all. But Janie, thank you very much.
Thank you both too. Well, I hope you all have a lovely evening. This has been fantastic. And yeah, hopefully this is the start of a lot more collaboration to come. Yeah, thank you all so much. Have a lovely evening.
Have a great night. Bye, everybody.
Bye.